Hey, welcome to the Roundtable. This is Jeff here with co-host Chip. We have a special guest with us tonight, Mark, right down here from the XRP community. Awesome to have you with us today. We've had you on the show a few times before, and there's so much that's happened since you've been on last time in the XRP space, in the blockchain space, DeFi blowing up, all sorts of things going on, Bitcoin hitting, over 11,000, and it's crazy what's going on right now. And we're going to get into all of that on today's show right now.
And now, the Roundtable with Jeff and Chip on the chain.
All right.
There he is, Mark Phillips. What is going on, Mark? It's good to see you.
Hey, guys. It is so good to be back with you.
Yeah, it's good. What is so much going on, Mark? I mean, where do we start? What's at the tip of your tongue? What's one of the, should we start with here?
The theme for me right now is movement. It's like we were in the wasteland wandering in the wilderness for 3 years, just watching nothing really happening, just rumor after rumor, but no real movement. And now there's movement, and there's movement all over the place. And frankly, it's kind of hard to keep up with. There's things happening in so many sectors that it's like, I don't know where you start.
You get bombarded with it, right? I mean, and also too,
absolutely.
We've been hearing about some regulation clarity, and all of a sudden popping out of nowhere. I mean, we had bills that went into committee and just died and collected dust. And then all of a sudden we had a couple of them pop. Darren Soto has his name on a lot of them. Mm-hmm. Proud of him. He's our Florida, representative, and not our personal one down here, but up in Orlando. But still, we'll claim him because he's in Florida. But it really is interesting to see that all of a sudden they're making it out of committee. They're getting votes. And it's great to see bipartisan support in Washington because this really is a bipartisan issue. And it's really phenomenal to see, hey, this one piece could be working and we could get there. But then you're like, well, we still got to they're still not, they're close. They're good. I mean, some of the bills like the what's the one called? The Compete, what's it called, Jeff? The
something Compete Act.
Yeah, the Compete Act, which I like. They've gotten friendlier on the language, which I think is important because, when you started using like token taxonomy, I mean, you're just going to confuse people. Now, if you just say, look, we want to be able to compete, more or less level the playing field, but, let the U.S. compete with all the other countries, especially it mentions, China specifically in there. But now people go like, oh, yeah, I get that. Okay, well, how do we do that? Well, blockchain and digital. Oh, okay. Yeah. If you kind of have to you make it more human, right?
I think you're right. And, packaging it, marketing it is really important, especially if you want to get some public support behind it. It can't be too wonky, that only a bureaucrat or a lawyer could read. It's got to be catchy, right? Right. One of the things that most people don't realize is that over the past 2 years, there have been at least 40 bills that have come somewhere in Congress. Some of them didn't make it out of committee. Some did, but at least 40 bills that dealt specifically with cryptocurrency and or blockchain. That's movement. And we've seen more recently bills actually coming out of committee, and that's progress.
Nice.
That's a great point. Is that we've seen a lot, and I think, just that fact alone, when you see bill after bill after bill, they don't necessarily have to pass. We want them to pass, but it doesn't work that way, as we know. It goes into Congress. If it's not perfect, if there's not, there's something, it just isn't right, they're going to either send it back or it just dies. But the fact that they keep pushing them in, I think that alone, that momentum, the growth of the number of bills that hit is important. I agree with you.
It absolutely is.
Yep.
Same thing with being bipartisan, like Chip mentioned.
Yeah.
That's really critical, particularly right now, since we're, there seems to be such a divide between the parties. If you have anything that has bipartisan support, it's kind of miraculous right now. And for me, that shows a recognition at some level of how truly important this is to our nation's security. And it's security at every level. It's economic security, it's military security, it's jobs, it's everything.
That's right.
If we really take the lead on it, and but if we don't, like Brad Garlinghouse said, if we sit on it, and there are others who are already fired up the engines and they're on the track.
That's right. Yeah.
The clock's running.
Yeah, I think you bring up a huge point about the bipartisan nature of it. It's funny because when you look at the news, you think that everything's divided, everybody hates each other. But at the end of the day, all these people have worked with each other for so long, that a lot of them go to the same parties, a lot of them go to dinner with each other. I mean, it's kind of like foolish of us to think that they don't get things done. And there's other bipartisan bills that do go through. We just never hear about them because they're relatively insignificant, right? They're not the hot button issues that everybody wants to highlight. But to your point, I think, yes, this is probably, it's one of those things that, getting the idea that it gets the bipartisan support is monumental, and like you said, the fact that it keeps pushing, bill after bill. And, I've talked about this a lot, I go into on video or live stream, the differences of opinion, the difference of approach, whether you're coming from a Republican side or a Democrat side, they need to come together, and that's where we get the success. And it's interesting, you look at it from a Democrat perspective, and their hot button is consumer protectionism. They want to protect the consumer. Everybody wants to protect the consumer, but that's like their hot button issue at the top of the list. Then from the Republican side, they want more, freedom of, financial liberty or whatever, however you want to phrase it. And then you bring them together and you come out with an important bill. What are your thoughts on that part?
I think that's absolutely right. And, finding common ground, finding things that everybody can agree on, is one of the ways that you're able to get things moving through Congress. When Brad Garlinghouse announced, and then it was echoed by other senior leaders in Ripple that they might have to move out of the U.S. We could talk about if they really intend to, but whether they really intend to or not, that sends a pretty strong message to the administration and to Congress that if we're going to move forward, we've got to have regulatory clarity. So it's not enough to have 40 bills floated in Congress if nothing ever happens with them.
Exactly.
It's not enough to have the Justice Department come out with a 70+ page paper that names multiple federal agencies that might have, who knows, jurisdiction over cryptocurrencies, and they all have different views on what they are and how they should be regulated. That's not helpful. And so if we're ever going to actually be the leaders like we probably should be, we aspire to be, if we're going to be the leaders in this space like we were, say, in the development and growth of the internet, we've got to have that clarity. Because without the clarity, it's just small-time investors like us, and you're not going to get the big institutions really buying in. And I know we've had some news lately about companies, publicly traded companies, buying Bitcoin, but that's still not the big money, and that's still not the institutional investment that's going to be required if this thing's going to take off. And that doesn't happen until there's regulatory clarity. And the companies know that they're doing it, and they're doing it in a way that is legal and protected, and they're not going to have some agency coming after them for doing what they thought was the right thing. What do you think?
Great observation. Yeah. So, and you brought up one point on the investment of these companies like MicroStrategy and Square buying into Bitcoin. I think that's more of it just affirms that this space is, the amount of money they're putting in. But you're right. They're tech guys. They're fired up about the space. They see the future, but that doesn't mean that the financial institutions are jumping in, or the typical mainstream corporation is going to jump into it. However, I think it's the beginning stages of it. It's the identification that, hey, we're a big corporation. We recognize the reality. We recognize the potential of this. So we're putting $400 million into it. We're putting, Square put 1% of their asset into it, $50 million. that's a big identifier. But like to your point, I don't think it's the end all be all. It's early, way early without regulation
Yeah,
or regulatory clarity, I should say.
and I think it's about time that we affectionately refer to Hester Pierce as Crypto Mom. I think we got to take the crypto out of her name. It's been 3 years now. Crypto Mom hasn't really been a positive force in the crypto part. She's been floating some ideas too, but she's really not really Crypto Mom. In order to kind of you got to earn that title. You got to put some legislation for it. Now I understand that she's not the end all, be all, and I know that she's not the one necessarily running the show over there at the SEC. But it is great when you see a guy like Brian Brooks, who came, who was chief legal counsel for Coinbase, and all of a sudden here's a person who's a man of action, right? He gets out there. I mean, in a very short period of time, he was appointed in May, and all of a sudden he started rolling stuff out in July, crypto being able to be custodied by banks, and he keeps continuing to and then the next thing you know, you see him over there with the head of the SEC, whose name escapes me at the moment, but they're having a webinar together, and now and all of a sudden you see the SEC stance changing a little bit about the importance of blockchain. So I think we're going to get it. And then Raoul Paul this week came out and said from a what's it called? Vision, what's his name? Real Vision. And, very well respected in the space, calling for $1 million Bitcoin and saying that, he feels about 3 to 5 years. But, everybody out there sees this coming. But I think the difference with someone like a Raoul Paul, he's talking to people we don't have access to. We only read about in the news. He's having these conversations with them. And he also knows that the regulatory clarity, once that gets some sort of a framework, then he knows the money's ready to, he called it a wall of money that's going to be coming in and pouring in. And once he starts seeing something like that happen, the beneficiary with the brand name of Bitcoin, it's a new front, but let's not kid ourselves. They're going to be flowing in the second, third, fourth, all top 10, top 15. It's going to disperse like, when it breaks through the dam, it's just going to go insane. So, when you see someone like a Raoul Paul calling for $1 million Bitcoin in 3 to 5 years, what are your thoughts about that, Mark?
It could happen. I don't
Right.
know. I mean, I have some pretty strong thoughts about proof of work, just as a mechanism, and its inefficiency. And when you see, okay, so I still have some Bitcoin. I used to have a lot more than I do now. But when I hear the language that's coming out of the World Economic Forum and out of the IMF, and even out of our own Congress, and it's about sustainability, it's about energy efficiency, it's about financial inclusion, it's about safety and security, protecting the individual investors and all that. Bitcoin's got some weaknesses, and so it's got the name recognition, and it was first out of the gate. And it could go, I mean, who knows how high it's going to go, because you're right. I think that's where the money is going to flow, because that's what everybody knows. Yeah. But at some point it doesn't stay there. It's not like Bitcoin has a lock on it. Once the money comes in, that's when you start to see the leveling change, as the companies and the tokens and the systems that they run on that have better business cases and have competitive advantage. That's where you start to see them really rise, once the money is really in, and once the institutions are really using these systems. And so, I think what I expect to see is that Bitcoin's going to have massive growth, but maybe not sustainable. That somebody's going to make a ton of money if they're in it now. But I think there's a huge amount of risk if you're thinking, I'm going to hold this for decades and decades, and it's going to be my legacy for my grandkids. I just don't see it as having that kind of sustainability. But back on, you guys had mentioned MicroStrategy and Square and some other companies that are starting to make public announcements of their investments in Bitcoin. There was a Rothschild fund that did as well. I think that's as much about signaling, maybe more about signaling than it is about actual investment. And I'll give you some examples. When you make headlines by, say, what MicroStrategy did, where they put in $250 million and then they added on another couple $100 million worth of Bitcoin, that gets headlines. Well, that's good for the company in terms of attracting investor attention and maybe clients, because they become top of mind. And it's probably good for Bitcoin, because if you see a company, putting a $500 million bet on Bitcoin, most people look at it and go, they know something I don't know. They're putting big money there. Maybe I should follow suit. Right. And so it's good for Bitcoin's price, but it's also good for the company that's doing it in terms of if they're trying to build market share, if they're trying to attract customers, if they're trying to increase their own corporate visibility. There might be strategic reasons for making that investment. I would be really surprised if they stayed in it if we revisited this in 10 years, if they still had a nearly $500 million position in Bitcoin. I'd be really surprised.
Yeah. I think you bring up an interesting point. First you mentioned that right now, the target is Bitcoin because it has the name recognition. As soon as more companies start getting into the Bitcoin, into digital asset, their first entry point may be Bitcoin, because that's what, again, like you said, that's what they're used to. That's what the name recognition. But as soon as you hit Bitcoin, the diversification comes, right? So then they start looking, well, where can we get the biggest gain? What has the most stability? What is, et cetera, and they start looking at it from that perspective. So I agree, the first point of entry may be Bitcoin. But as companies come in, just like individuals come in, first entry point was Bitcoin or Ethereum as one of the top. Then they start looking around. They say, oh, look, here's XRP. Look at their project. Look what they're doing. Here's XLM. Here's whatever it might be. I think companies are going to go along that same thought process, because at the end of the day, there's somebody at the top making that decision, or a few people, and they want to diversify. And then I would also have to agree that, their holdings are going to change. So that $450 million investment, even if it doubled right now, right? Let's say Bitcoin goes to 20,000, they just doubled their money. I mean, that's now $1 billion that they're sitting on. That's a nice valuation for that company. How are they going to make $500 million, in that period of time through their sales? Going to be very difficult. They may, they want to take that realized gain. They're going to do something else with it, so now all of a sudden you're going to see a change in their portfolio. And it might be diversified into other asset, might go into physical, might go into real estate holdings, might go into buying another company. Who knows what it's going to be, but that's how they think, that's how they strategize, and they're not long-term hodlers like an individual might be. It will be interesting to look forward, a year, 2 years, even 5 years from now. I don't even know if we have to go out 10 years. I think it's going to be a lot shorter period of time. Yeah. As soon as that investment doubles, you're going to start seeing movement of money going somewhere else. It just makes sense, right? To diversify but it's also interesting, the point that you brought up, about it being more than just that investment. What does it mean for the company? They're cutting edge. Okay, so MicroStrategy is now ahead of the curve. Hey, MicroStrategy has a potential of being, having a $1 billion nest egg in a short period of time. They're thinking a little bit ahead. Same thing with Square. So I think it is interesting. It's an interesting dynamic. And just a final point to hear what Chip thinks about this one. But I think that, you could also have a little bit of FOMO in the space where, hey, I'm going to buy $400 million. The market gets fueled, pushes it to 20,000. That's a pretty big whale buy-in. He could make an easy $500 million in a short period of time. Maybe that's all he's thinking about. Hey, if I FOMO it in, people are going to listen. It's going to blow up. I'm going to make a ton of money. What do you think?
He or she. Let's use the right pronouns here, Jeff. Just wanted to.
It was MicroStrategy I'm talking about.
I know, but you said he. It could be.
But isn't it he that made the decision at MicroStrategy?
Oh, it could be.
Michael Saylor.
Something like that. Well, I wanted to bounce back. So something you said, Mark, and it really had to do with, we talk about sustainability, right? So now we've had some Bitcoin maxis on the show, and one of the things they talk about is, well, there's always going to be an excess of power. A lot of times there's a power plant, I think somewhere in New York, that's using their power that's unallocated to really go mine Bitcoin. But regardless if it's being used or not, it's still energy that's being utilized. And you look at what it takes to mine Bitcoin across the world, it's pretty expensive. But going back to the other part of it, which I think, if you look at Ripple as a company and organization, yes, they are, it's capitalism. They're in business to make money, to make their investors money. That's what their mission is. But their mission's broader than that. And this is one of the things, whether you agree or disagree, the fact that they're talking about financial inclusion very early on the unbanked, and I did a video on the other channel, talked about 1.7 billion people. It's an incredible amount of people. You live in a place where, oh, there's a bank over here and there's one over there and we hate banks, blah, blah, blah. Well, how about if you don't even have a financial institution? There's no way for you, but the only thing you really have is this phone.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's all you really need. So now, Ripple's mission is bigger. So one of the things that came out at Swell was Mercy Corps, and they donated $10 million to sort of help, build, start with the fintechs and help them. And really what they're affecting is these unbanked. And if you look at Mercy Corps, what they're doing, they touched 30 million people last year, that they affected. And, 80% of their team members, almost 6,000 of them, come from the origin country that they're in. So they're doing something spectacular, I think. People are like, oh, Mercy Corps, what are they doing? Are they moving money? No, they're building the little tiny infrastructures that is going to bubble up, right? Because when we pull everybody up, we all win. And it's like, you can't look at the one sector of the world, just this sector. This is us. This is the one we care about. No. It's all about what you said, Mark, which is the financial inclusion. We pull everybody up. What does they say? The rising tide, raises all boats. That's what it's really about. And that's really what their mission is. Now, sometimes they get in the weeds about, they get into this thing and that thing. And, you had Coinbase come out and say, no, man, we're not a political organization. We don't take any sides. We're just a company doing our thing. Then the counter to it was like a Ripple coming out and saying, look, we're supporting this organization, that organization. So there is a fine line in what you do. But I think the unbanked, I think everybody can agree on the one point that we have to, as human beings on planet Earth, do we want to be me, or we want to help others and pull them up so that they can have, their hopes and dreams realized as well.
Chip, I think that's right. So, you guys know I'm a bit of a bleeding heart liberal. So not everybody. I also believe that we don't have to, see the world the same way to be friends and have civil discourse, and we all learn something in the process. So that approach, the way you just articulated it, Chip, really appeals to me. And I think it probably is true to the DNA of Ripple, but from a strategic perspective, it doesn't really matter. So if you look at how the company has structured itself, how it's deliberately engaged and worked with governments and other organizations like World Economic Forum and IMF and World Bank and many others. Everybody who pulls big strings or big levers in the global financial space, Ripple has engaged. And the appeal, I guarantee you, the appeal is not we're going to appeal to your heart and say, don't you want to help all the billions of poor people in the world? Personally, I think that's a wonderful thing, but I don't think that's the argument they're making. The argument they're making, I think, is much more strategic, and that is the global financial system is changing, and it's going to be digitized. And we have kind of one bite at the apple in terms of how we structure it and who the big players are and what the standards become. Do we want the standard to be VHS or beta? It's kind of that times 100, right? Because the stakes are so much higher than they were when you're picking, what kind of video cassette recorder what format you're going to use. And so I think Ripple's strategy is very clearly to engage with the organizations and the individuals that are going to make the big strategic decisions and influence those decisions. And I think that puts Ripple then in the position that they want to be. I mean, there's one quote that you've seen a million times from Brad Garlinghouse, and it says something along the lines of, Amazon is to books as Ripple wants to be to finance, right? So Amazon started with, Jeff Bezos selling books mail order out of his garage. But that is not where they are today. They're anything but that. I mean, they could probably not sell another book and be just crazy, crazy successful.
Yeah, a lot of people don't even
Amazon
know
Web
they sell books,
Services is
right?
right. It's kind of irrelevant at this point, but that was the wedge, right? That was how they got started. And so, Ripple focusing on these cross-border remittances in corridors that, that made sense, where they could offer something that was of value, that gets their foot in the door. That starts to get some traction. But that's not, I am absolutely convinced that's not the strategic goal.
Yeah,
the strategic goal is everything. That Ripple is somehow involved, Ripple systems are somehow involved in all the major financial flows anywhere in the world.
In the structure.
Yeah, but you can't start with that. You don't what kind of arrogance would you have to be a little startup in Silicon Valley and say, or in San Francisco, and say, you know what, we're going to dominate the world. Well, there's only 8 of you. I don't care. We're going to dominate the world. Where's your product? We don't have a product. What service? Oh, we don't have a service yet, but we're going to dominate the world. They get laughed out of the room. So if you start with this nice little doable thing, like cross-border remittances in specific corridors, people go, oh, okay, yeah, I see where there's room for improvement there, where you could get a toehold and make some money by saving individual customers and companies money and giving them a competitive advantage in that marketplace. That's how you start to grow it. So I think that's just strategy. I don't think that's ever where they intended to stop, but I think they've got a roadmap for how to get there. And it starts with, you start with a narrow little small, almost exotic product or service, and then you grow it out from there. But in the meantime, you're influencing and informing the policy decisions that come along and are going to shape that environment, so that when they make those policy decisions, they're picking products and systems that, just by a miracle, happen to really closely describe what you have to offer.
Yeah, that's
Speed,
interesting.
Cost efficiency, energy efficiency, security, decentralization. You just go down the list. Why? So do you think it's a coincidence that the World Economic Forum and the IMF head and the ECB head and folks at the Fed and the SEC talk about these things as being important criteria for a digital financial system?
That's right. Yeah,
I don't think it's coincidence at all.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. To take a slightly different approach to this. I think it's interesting. But the one point, I think, when they put this in place, and we could debate and argue, and we'll probably never know who was really behind the orchestration of Bitcoin, who was really behind the orchestration even of the Ripple technology, coming from David Schwartz. Where did it really start? Was it, government sponsored, otherwise, because governments think the long game. Individuals can try to think the long game, but we don't have enough time to think the long game. Companies don't even think, they can think out, quarterly, annually, 5 years, maybe 10 years, and then that's where it ends, So, but I look at a Ripple, and I see in taking on Swift, I think it was a very difficult strategy. That was, here you have a conglomerate that's entrenched in the space for how many years, since 1974, and they're targeting that marketplace with banks that are extremely slow moving, right? They make decisions really slow. Also understanding that if you're going to disrupt financials, you have to deal with governments, also really slow moving. So when you get into that kind of a system, you have to have some big players behind you that are going to open some major doors to make things happen. And so that's an interesting element that we're never going to understand or know. Maybe we will someday. But what was the impetus behind moving the structure, moving the system in that direction? Strategically, I agree with everything you said. I think there's a much bigger game to this. Unlike the VCR anecdote, the beta versus VHS, Ripple, I
Right.
think, changed the dynamics. They changed the game because on the XRPL, they have interoperability. So they don't even care if you're on beta or if you're on VHS. So I think that changes the dynamics. And they're showing over and over and over again that they don't care about that dynamic. Interoperability is everything, even coming down to, with the Flare network rolling out now on the XRP ledger, interoperability with the Ethereum, smart contracts, inclusion, getting out there. One area where, I might contrast, I don't know, but I believe that Ripple and the XRP, was their objective was going after, targeting the economics of big corporation, meaning banks, financial institutions, and governments. And then you had that division and the segue of Stellar and this, the Chip's point, looking at the unbanked. I'm not sure that Ripple was even really thinking about the unbanked, because all they're thinking about is the banked. Whereas Stellar spun off at kind of a critical moment, thinking only about the retail, thinking only about the unbanked. That was their initiative. And I think that was the segue, because you can't focus on both. It's almost impossible. The unbanked are a critical element. Chip brought up 1.7 billion people. There's a lot of people in the United States that live paycheck to paycheck that also are unbanked. We don't even think about that. We're like, well, you have banks everywhere. Well, they can't afford to bank. In places like India, they can't afford the banking system. It's too expensive for them. And a lot of other places in the world, in Africa, elsewhere, there might be limitation, access to the infrastructure, or just the cost of banking. That's why, the two can't be tied together in that initial marketing push. Strategically, like you said, I mean, it would be interesting to find out, did they divide and conquer at that point, to say, you go after retail, we're going to stay focused on financial institutions and banks? Because if you go into a bank, like you said, and you say, well, we're here to help the unbanked, they're going to laugh you out of their office, say, that's not our market. We're here to bank the banked, and that's it. Whereas,
Right.
like Chip was saying, if you could help boost the people from the unbanked community that are living on fiat currency, it's going to be amazing. Financial inclusion, because those people in the unbanked space, as we all know, without having access to banking, means you don't have access to loans, means you don't have access to business loans, meaning you don't have access to loans for your vehicles. You don't have access to a mortgage. You don't have access to a lot of things which make you and help you become part of the society, the economic society. To me, there's two dynamics going on. What do you guys think on that one?
I think I absolutely 100% agree with you. So if you think about, and we hear about, there's all this animosity between Stellar and Ripple. But when have you ever heard anybody at Ripple talk bad about Jed or Stellar? You haven't.
Never.
When have you heard Jed or Stellar say anything bad about Ripple, XRP, or any of the people who work there? Nothing. There's nothing there. So if it is possible, I think that they had some kind of fundamental disagreement early on about where they were trying to take the company and what big problem they were trying to solve. And maybe they decided to go separate ways using similar technology. And because they're using really, really similar technology, you would expect them to be at each other's throats, right? Because who's the biggest competitor for, on the surface, if you just look at the technology, who's Ripple's biggest competitor? It's probably Stellar. If you look at Stellar, who's their biggest competitor? It's probably Ripple. So you would expect them to just be clobbering each other, and they don't make a peep about each other, right?
Well, that's probably legal. Probably legal reasons.
Well, it might be.
They're also
that might be part of their agreement.
They're playing in different sandboxes.
They are.
I think that's what it is. I think you're right.
Yeah, but it's
different size of the sandbox, anyways.
But isn't it interesting though that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Stellar started getting into CBDC spaces? Wait a minute. So, everything kind of comes full circle. It's all of a sudden you started hearing about these central banks that were then talking with Stellar about using their blockchain or trying to, in some way, almost do a private version so that it was like they could take bits and pieces of it. And you started seeing, but I also think that fundamentally they're set up differently. The Stellar Foundation And they're more like a hands-off type of thing where it's more, I mean, their whole concept was the decentralization. You know, you had Jed coming from, you know, the Mt. Gox debacle, right? It's amazing how he skated through that untouched. Everybody else ended up in bad shape, and he just like zipped right through, you know? It's like,
He
and
must buy Teflon by the case.
he really must. I mean, it's amazing. Like you look back at that whole thing when that thing hit, and everybody except for him, he went through, and then next thing you know, he's breaking out. And you know, I think they recently didn't they allow him to sell more of his XRP too. People say like, well, why is he selling all his XRP? Well, think about it. I mean, you know, if you came from this company, you know, there's the whole, you know, the German company, you had Adidas and then Puma. They broke off. They were brothers. They broke off. They started doing their own thing. So it would look real odd if the brother who started Puma started wearing Adidas stuff. You know, it's just like it's counter to what your argument is. It's like, hey man, well, wait a minute, you're still wearing Adidas? You know, I mean, what are you doing? So I kind of look at it like it kind of surprised me when I started seeing them trying to get into CBDC game, and it was recently that Jed spoke at one of these conferences where he started talking. I'm like, wait a minute, did you start working for Ripple again? Because that, like Jeff had said earlier, that you know it was all about the retail space. They were going for users and more of the retail sort of you know, passing money, purchasing stuff. Where even though Ripple's starting on the one side, I think Brad Garlinghouse said in one of his interviews where he said, look, this is just the starting point, this cross-border. There's a lot of stuff we can tackle, but you don't sit there and let the cat out of the bag right away. You know, you have to kind of like let things kind of take some, you know, kind of root first, and then you kind of move on to the next thing. And, you know, it's why when you get back to this past week where it was a little bit of a different sort of a swell just because it was a virtual one, but I was kind of shocked because, you know, I had applied and I got denied, and, you know, I applied for my company, you know, in the company that I work for, the sister company, which I spent 6+ years at, you know, we built a platform and still run a platform for the last 10 years for a giant in the space. It's a household name, not only in the US, but around the world. Right? They did $9 billion in that platform. Wow. And there's no space for you on your application to say, hey, how could we take this money and move it quicker? Because yeah, cross-border is great, but when we start looking at the other use cases for what we can actually accomplish, it's moving money, period. Moving money from San Francisco to Miami, right? Even if it's within the same country, you still got all the same problems. You still, you know, they're still there. You can do it faster, cheaper, better. And when you're talking about $1 billion and you're talking about moving money, it certainly bodes well for the success of any company as a whole. If you can figure out a way, how do we do it better, cheaper, you know, faster? How do we do that? And this is one of the things. In the meanwhile, I see like, you know, I see goofball, you know, YouTuber, hey, I'm going to this thing. It's like, okay, that's fine. I'm not doing that. But when you fill out an application and they're asking you from your company, and they say, you fill out your name, you fill out your thing, you put your email and your website, and they're going to make a decision based on that. They don't know anything about why I'm interested from a technology standpoint of what they're up to. You know, not that it would have mattered anyway, but my point is that if you're going to accept people in a virtual, now I get if you don't want to have people there going there, but this was virtual. So for them not to have more inclusion, let's talk about, you know, investor inclusion. They should have had more investors. They should have had it available for more people to see. That the way they safeguarded that, look, there's press there. The stuff's coming out. There was a session and boom, there's an article that hit. You know, it's not like it was any big secret. So why not allow more people in the community? This is the part that kind of shocked me a little bit, just from, you know, not only as somebody, you know, as an investor from XRP or someone who cares a lot about Ripple, but, you know, why do you think that is, Mark, that they were holding it so tight to the vest when there really weren't any big overwhelming? I mean, there was a lot of stuff that happened, but it wasn't like, oh, we've got this giant secret and we only want to make sure it goes out to this channel. Why do you think that was? Why do you think
I don't have an answer. I have no idea. Because the way
weird.
You described it, the way you described it, you know, makes sense, and no answer comes to mind. I don't know why they would do that.
Yeah,
Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, Chip and I had discussed this before. You know, when it comes down to conferences, I think,
Mhm.
I go to a lot of conferences, and
Mhm.
typically, there's some release of technology at a conference, but at the end of the day, that's not necessarily what it's all about, because you have a lot of representation at the conferences from different manufacturers or whatever it might be. It's more about the networking opportunity. In a
Right.
financial conference, it's not any different. It's just a bunch of, ideas coming together. We're going to present, we're going to talk. We got to do this annually. Because if you don't do it annually, you can't always have some like major thing. But some of the stuff that they did release was, it's a big, it's a big deal for them. It's not, it wasn't a big deal like, life changing or anything like that. But in a conference setting, but going virtual, we're getting ready to do our first virtual conference in a couple weeks, and it's just funny. I don't get it. From an education perspective, people that are engaged on that side, hey, maybe you'll learn something. Honestly, I don't think a lot of people are going to watch, on our conference anyways. I don't know. But in this scenario, why not just open it up, but, like Chip was saying, it was funny. He was explaining to me how he was applying for it for his company, but they didn't ask anything. But maybe there's another channel to go through. Maybe that, online application wasn't the end all be all. Maybe there's another, secret way of getting in. I don't know. It was just kind of funny. That was their public
Secret
facing
handshake.
Yeah, it was the secret name,
That's
because it
right.
makes no sense. Why would you have an application like that that's not an application? That's just like put in your email, and that means you're just open to the public, because you're not scrutinizing why they want to be here. It doesn't, I don't know. It doesn't really make sense, but I think a lot of people within the community have approached Swell from an irrational perspective.
It,
Again, I don't think it's, they're not looking to drop big bombs at Swell. It's for the community. It's for the industry. It's interesting for the industry. That's about it. It's all about the networking. And, my final thought, being virtual, you lost the whole element of the networking aspect, and they
Right.
still had to do it, but it's almost like a pointless thing. That's why it's just I don't know. It's
Jeff, if
not
I
so
could,
exciting for
I
me.
just wanted to
Yeah, go
clarify
ahead.
something that I thought of, because I said,
Yeah,
a goofball YouTuber or whatever. I wasn't necessarily saying it in a bad way, especially Crypto Eddie did an amazing job reporting from there. And, some of the other YouTubers, it wasn't about putting somebody down. It's just like, it's like there has to be some sort of, what I was really trying to roll it into is like, well, why
distinction.
would you, right, but why would you have me as a YouTuber anyway? That wouldn't make any sense. As a YouTuber, it's like, oh, I'm a guy that talks about on a channel that nobody goes to and watches. I mean,
Well,
so
why
who
can't you
cares?
get in for your company? I mean,
Right.
you're
Well, that's the
involved in the
thing.
financial space, and you can't find the easy path in to
Right.
apply for it. That made no sense.
No, that's exactly right. But as like just a YouTuber, like, hey, someone in a space, a guy that creates videos, does the show called the XRP Minute, does that make sense as a goofball YouTuber? Maybe not. I mean, but having the same people over and over again, we had people that we went in the space, last year that we had the invitation. Look, going there is a very different thing. I get that, right? And most of the time, there's a cost to a conference. Even the virtual ones. I mean, same as Jeff, go to a lot of conferences. It's like for us, it's not about the sessions. I never see them. It's always about the networking opportunities, and most
It's
of
the
it,
hallway.
and the hallway.
Mhm.
But 99.8% of it, at least in my and what I do, is at the bar. I did more deals sitting at a bar drinking
Yeah.
whiskey than I can ever tell you that I met. You bump into someone, hey, where are you heading? I'm heading
Yeah.
to the bar. Let's go grab a drink. And it's like there's something about eating together, drinking together, that's just goes back thousands of years. It's just like this is what humans do, how they communicate, because it loosens you up a little bit. You start talking about stuff. And the funny thing I find about that is, like, you're all business. You got your suits on. You're like, oh, well, you're talking the language, and how are you? And you're standoffish. You get to the bar, the tie comes off. You're drinking whiskey,
Right.
telling stories, laughing, and that's really how we do business, right?
It's
That's how it really
relationship builder.
happens.
Yeah.
It's all about the
Relationships.
Yeah.
relationships. Business, there's no mistake in business. It's all relationship driven. You're going to do business with those who you enjoy, being around. Yeah, I mean, there's some people you're like, oh, I got to do this. The guy is good. He's an asshole, but I still got to do business with him, But then, but the dynamics shift, because like you said, you go to the
Right.
bar, all of a sudden you're like, oh, this guy's pretty. He's a pretty good guy. I actually like him. He's just a little rough around the edges, and then all of a sudden there's a dynamic shift. I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just as a just to kind of move things, a little bit. And I'm not sure exactly how this is going to pan out, but starting tomorrow, there's going to be the IMF, I guess, is meeting, and Chairman
Jeff,
Powell is supposed to be speaking over there. Yeah.
Get out of my head. Get out of my head.
Oh, we just didn't talk about that.
I can't do
I don't
that.
know how you did it, but get out of my head, man.
Well, I'm gonna amaze you. Wait till your next talk.
That's how I do this. Let's say, Chip, you do the next one, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, so last time we talked, Alanis Morissette provided the theme. This time it's REM, and the song is "It's the End of the World as We Know It."
It's the end of the
so we talked.
as we know it.
Yeah, you better watch it. You're gonna have to pay some money. Apparently, the royalties are pretty steep.
We just got.
So we've had all kinds of conferences, Swell and others. We've had. We talked about the congressional bills, being introduced and getting some traction. We've got apparently more QE coming, whether we call it QE or not. They're now talking about another ballpark $2 trillion that's going to get dumped in somewhere. We've got new record debt for the nation. We've got interest rates that are inching lower and lower and lower out of necessity. This is a world we've never lived in before. And then, as Jeff just mentioned, we've got the IMF that's been meeting for the past week. And tomorrow, on Monday, there's some pretty big events, like with Chairman Powell speaking. But this is the IMF meeting where every 5 years they select which currencies are going in the SDR basket for the next 5 years. I think I saw one report that said they had agreed to double the size of the basket, the amount of money that was or value that's available in the basket for loans. But I've not heard a peep yet about what the basket will be, which currencies will constitute the next 5 years of SDRs. I think that's potentially massive, depending on what comes out. There had been speculation before about there would be a cryptocurrency, and then the IMF rules mandated that at least one country had to have a CBDC already for that to happen. Well, we've now got multiple countries. So China's rolled out their digital yuan, the Bahamas rolled out the sand dollar, and there are many other countries that are moving really, really fast. The e-krona and others. So I think that criterion has already been met. And then we have other things that are happening, like I don't know if you watched the Lynette Zhang video about how this weekend we're shifting from LIBOR as a way to calculate overnight interest rates to SOFR. Right. It might be smooth as silk and nothing changes, or Monday morning all hell might break loose. We don't have any idea because we've never done this before. But it's interesting that all of these things are happening at the exact same time. And then you go back to some of the more macro views. We're still 10 years into a bull market, where the stock market has, it doesn't move up in a straight line, but, it has consistently moved up over time. And we're now 10 years into what's normally a 7 or 8 year cycle. So one way to look at that is we're 2 or 3 years overdue for a correction, which hadn't happened yet. And I think my perspective is it hadn't happened because we've been dumping in all this stimulus money that, as we know, has largely gone right into the market, either through stock buybacks or some other mechanism. Yep. And so there's a reckoning on that at some point. And it's interesting to me that all of these things are lining up to kind of hit their crescendo at the exact same time.
That's a good point. Yep. And it goes back to your observation on Ripple and their strategies and everything else, and goes back to what's really behind it. Chip, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, the timing seems to be lining up. There's a star alignment with things rolling out. What's the significance?
Well, I think that's why you hear so many. You hear this talk of the some sort of a reset coming up, because you cannot continue. When it's artificially propped up, look, I mean, everyone knows how it ends, right? Badly. It doesn't end well when you start playing with trillions of dollars of debt and you start looking at this global debt and this global crisis that breaks out. So it's almost like everybody's forced. I mean, there's the conspiracy theorists talking about, well, the financial reset's going to look like this, and there's going to be a debt jubilee, and it's all going to be forgiven. Those are all great thoughts, but even if you do something like that, there's going to be a fallout, right? It doesn't just, you don't just flick one switch. Let's turn that light off and let's turn this one on. And, the numbers have always been played with largely. I look at it from a point of where you look at this current administration with the way they calculate everything. I don't care if it's unemployment, whatever. It's all playing with the numbers. Every administration does it and then takes credit for it, but it's all garbage. It's you're playing around with you have a central bank, you have the Federal Reserve, which, by its own existence and how it came into existence, does not benefit. Central banks don't benefit any country, okay? Because they're all about control. They want control. They don't want to lose control. And you wouldn't even hear any language about a CBDC. But now, isn't it interesting that now they're all jumping on the bandwagon? Well, China did it, and we did it. But again, it's likening the digital yuan to blockchain is about as far away as you can get, right? Centralized control. It's a really good methodology if you want to have that control. So central banks like that idea, but even if you have all these CBDCs, you still need the interoperability, and that's really where Ripple has positioned itself to win, right? Because in order to move money, you look at Ripple's. You look at their little bio, the little tagline on their social media account on Twitter, and it says, moving money to all corners of the world. Well, guess what? That looks like CBDC. So country A moving country B, you're going to have the interoperability. This is really sort of where the success comes from. But I look at all of this stuff, this financial reset talk and all these conversations, you can't, if you it's like it's that old parable, the king, what is it, has no clothes. What is that one? The emperor has no clothes, right? Everyone watches the new suit as he walks down naked, and this is what we're doing. We're all pretending, and we're all sort of like conditioned to pretend, and we all know. I mean, people that pay a little bit of attention to it know it's just a farce. But, we all kind of play along, and it's like, okay, we have zero, and then you have negative interest in Europe, and then you have what's coming in Europe, which looks even really bad. And then you have this whole control of SWIFT where the U.S. can shut a country off, and nobody wants that. So all roads will lead to Ripple in a sense of, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, out of 40, from going from 1974 to present, it was weird how SWIFT was like, we're cool with it. It works, it's a messaging system. It doesn't work. I mean, it's got a high failure rate of 11 to 12%, but it's okay. We've always done it that way. And all of a sudden, they got injected. They got a little kick in the behind because Ripple said, "Well, guess what? We're coming for you." And I go back to that one. That one conference that Brad was at, and they put a question up behind him. And it was like, do you want to get to me? What was going on there spoke so loudly of what was happening.
He was almost giddy. Yep. He was almost giddy when he was like, you want to answer this one? You want me to answer it? It's for you, but you want me to answer it? Like it hit at the very heart of what they're about. That was my takeaway.
That was exactly right. And and that's already aged a little bit. And you look at that, you can't see a guy like Garlinghouse showing up at all of these important places with the important central bankers, with all the important, and we're going like, and the community.
You don't get in the door. You don't get in the door, much less at the head table.
Right. And then the community's going, nothing's happening. There's nothing happening, and there's no price movement. Well, look, one of the great things about XRP is the fact that it's got to have stability. It's proven the stability. Mm-hmm. You're out there trying to sell this stuff and say, well, it's only 24 cents. It's only 25 cents. Yeah, but it stabilizes, right? It might move up a little bit, comes down, but it's not like 0.002 today and then it shoots back up to 20 cents. There has to be some stability.
Yeah, that's I think the point. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jeff. I was just going to say, I think we use the term stability to mean lack of volatility. And the
That's
real
right.
critical thing is
That's the
lack of
point.
volatility.
There you go.
So
Yep.
stability implies that the price never changes.
Yes.
In Ripple's case, or XLM or any of the others, if they get mass adoption, is the price will change. It will move up. But what the institutions don't want is it fluctuating up and down and up and down in these big price
Correct.
swings, because
Big, yeah.
that's toxic for them.
That's perfect.
But the price changing isn't necessarily bad, as long as it's holding that value and is moving up incrementally over time.
That's right.
So stability, I think, gives people the wrong impression that it has to, one XRP has to equal a quarter. That's not true. It's the lack of volatility that makes it attractive to the banks and the governments, I think.
That's a perfect, yeah, that's exactly what I was, yeah, I like that. I agree. I mean, it's amazing. We talk too much about stability, but it's 100% volatility. And that's where it's interesting too, because if you look at penny stocks, typically penny stocks are easily manipulated, right? So you have an asset at 24, 25 cents, you would think you would have huge swings, right? I mean, you would have a whale come in and you can push the valuation of it easily, based on, there's a lot of it out there, but you just need a little bit of FOMO and you should be able to move it from 25 cents to $1, back down to 25 cents, down to 10 cents. You have all these major swings. And to your point, the volatility aspect is so critical. And that's what they're looking at, volatility through, stability of that volatility, meaning that it's
Right.
staying consistent. It's up a few percent, down a few percent, just like in the FX market. I mean, you see, currency fluctuations, and the currencies that have big fluctuations are the countries that are struggling, or the currency you don't want to hold. I talk a lot about, my dealings with India and the volatile rupee to dollar, valuation over the years with their big swings, and it impacted the cost of goods tremendously, for them. So that is, I think the most important takeaway from all of this, and looking at why Ripple, what's different about what they're doing, why is the world looking, why are the governments looking? Just one point on the CBDC aspect Chip brought up earlier with Stellar. I still don't think that XRP and Ripple, that's their focus. I look at the CBDC, and if they're looking at a currency, it's still out of the realm. That currency is more in the realm of Stellar and XLM, because it's going to retail. It's something that's going to be spent on a daily basis in micropayments. And Ripple and XRP, that's not their focus. I think they're looking at big movements, even though they say they narrow their focus down. They might be not, now it's not trillions, maybe it's millions, but it's still not dollars, individuals. And that's where build a CBDC on the Stellar platform backed by IBM. It's an open source nonprofit versus a for-profit entity that, it's just a different approach.
So what do you think about, and there's been a lot of discussion in the last week or so about like a US dollar coin or token built on Stellar, built on XLM, and that XRP and RippleNet would be used for the big international movements. Do you think that's how it's going to shake out?
I think it would make sense. I don't know if the U.S., it's going to, Chip had mentioned they're going to make it their own. They're going to take it and build something on the platform. To me, it would make more sense that they do it that way. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but to build a CBDC based off of the Stellar platform that is connected, to the XRPL, we know how that relationship is. Let each focus on what their strength is going to be, so you can develop. Right. And you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So I think it would be bad, if governments actually start looking at Ripple, because then they're going to start saying, well, you can't control the economies. You definitely can't control the global economies. So you might even have some currencies that are built on the XRPL, some that are built on Stellar, some that might be built on something else. But it can't be all in one. But I'm seeing more of that, that clear, distinct division.
And I'm not really comfortable with the Federal Reserve. I don't like the fact that any country doesn't have its sovereignty, where you're looking at them controlling their future. It's like, well, the U.S. does not United States government doesn't, you have the Federal Reserve as a separate entity. And I don't like the fact that it's, one of the strategic things that the administration did was they brought it, because of this pandemic, they were able to bring that in the Treasury, right? So it's a weird kind of a thing where you almost have a little bit of control over it. But I think if you're going to look at, I think the whole system moving forward, central banks are going to lose control. They're not going to be central banks.
Yeah.
Countries want to have control of their own destiny. They don't want to be paying. You cannot build a system on debt and then continue to have that sustainable in the future. And I don't like the idea. I'm not comfortable with an idea. If you're going to roll out a digital dollar, it has nothing to do with the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve, what are they going to do? They're going to make as many as they want. Well, we'll release 100 billion. Then, I'm sorry, 200 billion. And then now we're going to have we have the same thing in a digital format, where it didn't work with the fiat format. So I don't like the fact. I think at some point you got to do away with the Federal Reserve, and every country is going to move in this way. I feel like because it's the debt, you just can't afford the debt. And then you have things going on where you don't even know what their balance sheet looks like. Yeah, you can get an idea, but we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. There's never been an audit, and this happens all over the world. No, every country's not auditing their federal bank. It's almost like this secret society which worked 100 years ago. It doesn't play anymore, not with the fintechs we have around today. If we're going to build a better, brighter future, we have to do it by control. The best way to do that would be to bankrupt. Who knows more about bankruptcies than the guy that's sitting in that big White House right now? You just bankrupt that place, right? You go through bankruptcies, and that's exactly what you do. You bankrupt them. You run up the credit card. Well, I know a lot about bankruptcy. I work somewhat in the space. So the whole idea of bankruptcy is you run up the credit cards, you run up the debt, and then you file bankruptcy. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like what we're doing right now. We're running it up. Let's print more, 2 trillion, 2 trillion. You have all this quantitative easing going on.
Because it doesn't matter.
Right, it doesn't matter. You're breaking a system, and then you're moving into another realm. But for any country to come out with their own central bank digital, you're doing more insult to injury, because you're going down the same road that never worked. It won't work. And to me, now if the U.S. government comes out with something and they pull it out of the Federal Reserve, that's your first step towards getting away from the Fed. But for the Fed to do it, I'm sorry. And any central bank doing it, I've never been on board with the CBDCs. All it is lipstick on a pig. It's like, it's still the same crappy looking thing. And it's like, but it's kind of better, doesn't it? Because it's digital and it'll get everybody excited. No, that's not what's going to happen. But that's just I have some real strong opinions, and they're held pretty, I wouldn't say loosely, they're held close to the vest, but I just don't like this whole idea. I think the best part of fintech is that we are breaking away from banks. We are breaking away from central control. Decentralization doesn't mean let's give all the control back to the central bankers again. That's bad move, in my opinion.
It also doesn't mean anarchy. So, the original Bitcoinists, they looked at it, say, hey, we're getting rid of banks 100%. It's a different focus. So you have a decentralized type of I think, to Chip's point, really interesting. But the P2P space in lending, borrowing has been proven. We look at it with Prosper. There's others that do it in the real estate space, and they were really, really successful, allowing individuals to lend to other individuals and make money off of that interest. If people don't have to go borrow from banks. Now, you can't do that. I can't easily lend you money without a system in place. Prosper was the system, to allow you to go on, invest your money, and they can break it up, and they do banking type things in the background. Celsius is doing banking type things in the background, allowing that to be orchestrated. Ripple and RippleNet is obviously working with banks to allow them to do banking type things. But what we're seeing is that it cuts out all of the fat, right? All of the manpower overhead that in the bureaucracy that weighs it down tremendously gets cut out. And all of a sudden you have a streamlined solution. And to Chip's point, it takes away the control from the central bank, and allows there to be more sovereignty to the government, but vis-a-vis the people, right? The people need more sovereignty over the currency. The government needs more sovereignty over the currency, and you can't allow the banks to continue that that manipulation and control. Yet you still need banking. You can't live without the banking aspect, but there needs to be a better balance, and we've seen it go in a different direction, where the banks, the central banks, the Federal Reserves across the globe have all the power, all the control, and they've lived that way for too long, and they're manipulating the governments, right? Because they're holding all the purse strings. So it's like this, you get it like this, to where the government, meaning the people, get a little bit more balance in place, and all of a sudden things change. The whole dynamics change.
Yeah, I agree. And I think at the retail level, there's going to be massive disruption. So companies like Proppy and others who are moving into the real estate space and putting things on the blockchain, which radically changes things like title searches and a lot of the activities that cause delays and drove up prices when you're doing real estate transactions. So I think that's happening. What do you think about the IMF director saying we are now at a new Bretton Woods moment?
That was interesting. Jeff, you want to take that one? I have my own thoughts about that. I don't want to go on a real tirade about that, but go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, look, I mean, we look at Bretton Woods. We look at, after the war, you got a bunch of the smart minds that assembled, and we're going to sort of map out how the financial infrastructure is going to work, right? And this is how we're all going to go forward, and how we're going to rebuild, parts of, Europe and everything. The choice of wording is really interesting to me, because it's almost like that. What you go back to, Mark, is that signaling, right? It's a signaling. That's like, well, what are you really signaling? So you're signaling for something's got you have to make a radical shift. Not radical in the sense of like, wow, that's so out there, but in a sense of like how we've normally come to know the system we all know is going to change significantly. I mean, without knowing exactly what was behind those words, and I'll put the question back to you, but I think that was a big signal to say, hey, be on the lookout, because this is just it's a little like crumb, you throw it out there, a new Bretton Woods moment, because you really realize that the change is coming. What was your thoughts when you heard that? What did you think?
That was it exactly. That was the warning order. It's change is coming. We're not going to tell you exactly what it is, but just know that it's on the horizon, which is the signal to to participate, to get ready, to do whatever. There were, the Bretton Woods history, and, there were differing views on how we should go forward. And one of them prevailed, and another major one did not. And so, some people think that we might be going back to that alternative view, where we go to a Bancor type gold-based something. I think there's some possibility that as the central banks have basically bankrupted themselves, and for each nation, the central bank was the lender of last resort, and certainly in the U.S., the lender of last resort for the commercial banks. Now that they've essentially bankrupted themselves, does the IMF become the lender of last resort for the central banks? And if so, is there one unit of measurement, one monetary unit that all those transactions are done in? And if so, what is that? Is it an SDR? Is it, which makes the press conference that they're supposed to have tomorrow even more important, as they're supposed to announce, I believe, what is going to be in that new SDR basket. So again, I think it's the end of the world as we know it, and big changes on the horizon.
That's it. Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, it's amazing. The signaling aspect of it. We'll never know what goes on behind closed doors. And these are things that have been orchestrated for a long time. They're not in reactionary mode. Like I was saying earlier, governments play the long game. They've strategized. Right. They've looked at this. They've seen the writing on the wall for a long time. Even going to this idea of this global black swan event that was talked about but not identified, which is kind of shutting down the entire world due to an illness, and destroying the economies globally, and still persevering, meaning they still want to push for the shutdowns regardless of the facts on the ground, which puts more of a pressure on the economies. And it seems like everything that's being orchestrated right now is purposeful, for an resolution and solution. And again, it just seems it's too perfect. I forget who it is said there's no such thing as a coincidence. It doesn't just all happen at the same time, right? And so that means that something happened before. We know there's different forces at play. We know there's forces butting heads. The pieces are being moved around the board right now. If you look at risk, the game risk, that one country had, one player was overweighted with all of his armies all over the place. All of a sudden there was an imbalance. Now his roles are, someone else is taking over. All of a sudden you see a shift, and that's what we're seeing, a seismic shift, both politically and economically around the world right now. And it's amazing. If you pull back just a little bit, you can see it unfolding, from a political perspective. We're already seeing the concentration of power and allies being drawn in the Middle East. And that to me is monumental, because you're going to have a seismic shift in the economic balance away from oil, that's going to incorporate technology that people, it's amazing to me that, we're going through an election cycle right now in the United States. There's not one question, one discussion on the shift of the power balance right now in the Middle East. It's going to change everything, right? Because now we're seeing a withdrawing of powers out of China, meaning manufacturing powers. So we see China is definitely orchestrating their pieces on the board, trying to figure out how they're going to have regional influence, the CBDCs, the digital assets, all of this, but the fact on the ground is what's happening right now in the Middle East, because you're seeing partnerships forming right now between Israel and the Arab allies. Economically speaking, the UAE is a powerhouse economically. Bring in Israel where they are in technology, and you pour billions of dollars into the technology that Israel is developing. What's going to happen? Right? You're going to see it's just going to blow up in the Middle East. We see for years Saudi Arabia has been investing huge amounts of money in artificial intelligence because they want to capture the technical market share. Now you see the Sudan is now traveling to Israel. Soon you're going to see a peace agreement between Saudi and Israel. So what's happening is that you have this coalition forming that's never happened before in the Middle East, and that's an economic powerhouse and brain power like you've never seen. The other side of it is Iran, which is tied somehow to, Russia, that's tied somehow to North Korea, that's tied somehow to Venezuela. That power is only, they're taking money, investing it in military might with a destructive end, but yet their economies are crashing, right? They have no economics anymore, and they're trying to circumvent the world's economics. It's too late. The shift has already been laid out. I don't care what they do. They want to circumvent SWIFT. It's going to have no meaning because the borders are being drawn right now. And that everyone is missing the point on that completely. And it's mind-boggling to me that nobody's focusing on it, because when we say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the Middle East is going to be an economic powerhouse outside of oil like we've never seen before. And all of what we're talking about right now is critical because it's all going to be in tech.
Jeff, you just described the end of the world as we know it. Something
that's
that Mark...
right, exactly. That's exactly.
By the way, that's going to be that's obviously the theme right there. I love that you coined that. And just like the end of the world as we know it, there also is the end of the stream as we know it.
Oh, that's right.
When we come up on time here, but I wanted to. I know we could go on talking forever. It's always so great having you on, Mark, because man, it's like it just flows, man. There's such a nice flow and such a nice dialogue and conversation that happens. But I do want to say that we're going to do Backstage with Mark Phillips on Cinnamon, exclusively on Cinnamon. So click that link below. If you click that link below and walk over there, we're going to continue the conversation over there. But Mark, just any closing words before we get out of here and go backstage with you?
I'd say make sure your seatbelt is fastened and tightened. Strap in.
Is it the kind you strap in, or is it that like when you go on those rides, that big thing that comes over top of you, so when you turn upside down, you don't fly out of the ride?
I'll take all of it. I'll
Okay,
take
thank-
all of it.
Good.
gotta
All of the
strap
above.
down.
I think it's going to be a wild ride.
I
Yeah,
agree.
it's gonna be fun, isn't it? For sure.
It's awesome.
All right, Jeff. Anything before we get out of here?
That sums it up. I think that's it. Put your seatbelt on. It's the end of the world as we know it.
And
I'm ready to move on.
World as we know it. By the way, if anyone knows every lyric of that song, I get tripped up at parts of it, but I know a few parts. Where you sing along and then I can't keep up.
We can talk about that on the backstage.
We'll talk about that backstage. Listen, everybody, thank you once again for being here. We have some of the smartest human beings on the planet in our chat, and it's always great to have you with us. And you are what makes it worthwhile doing this. Your participation, your comments, just being here with us every Sunday night when we do the roundtable. Mark Phillips, thank you so much for joining us. You can always learn more about us at onthechain.io. See both of our channels, our other channels down below. I'm Chip. That's Mark. That's Jeff. We're out of here. We'll see you backstage.
Take
Link
us
is
out.
below.
It's up.
Are you down with OTC? Please like, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified when the next video drops.